All right, I think that is working. Great. Well, greetings from rainy Western Oregon. Glad to be here. So I think my role in this whole operation is to provide a little bit of an introduction, sort of high-level overview of Good Neighbor generally, and then different presenters will get into details about what's happening in Oregon and Washington. So yeah, we'll talk through a little bit of the history, purpose, and use, how revenue works, put it in context with other authorities, and then also talk about some questions that I've heard from collaboratives specifically. So if I don't answer anything that you're interested in, I encourage you to go to the RVCC website. I should have introduced myself, so I'm with Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. You can check out our 2018 report. We're in the process of updating that right now, so we'll have more up-to-date snapshot across even more of the West pretty soon, probably next couple of months. So I encourage you to check that out. And that was made possible with funding from US Forest Service, state and private forestry, and then also Region 6. So Good Neighbor, what is it? Well, you know, it's a federal authority and it allows partnership between states, tribes, and counties with public land management agencies at a federal level. All focus really just on the Forest Service, but it is applicable in the BLM context as well, although they don't seem to use it as much, and it's really outside of my knowledge space. What it does generally is allows forest, watershed, and rangeland restoration. There were various versions of it. Started as a pilot in 2001, rolled out nationwide in 2014. We've seen it made more permanent and expanded in 2018, and we're continuing to see proposed changes to it. So it's very much sort of a live authority. High level, and again, we'll hear details from other presenters, but allows for forest, watershed, and rangeland restoration. So that can be habitat improvement, fuels management, insects and disease. Won't read the whole list. A lot of it is, I would say the work that we're seeing is really rolling out through commercial timber removal as a component of restoration, but it's a really broad authority and allows a lot of different kinds of work. Part of the purpose was just to improve coordination between state and federal agencies. Definitely seems to be doing that. And then also increase capacity to do restoration. Some noteworthy aspects of it is that it allows the retention of timber revenue for additional work. So think stewardship contracting. We'll talk about some differences in a minute, but if you sell timber, that money can stay within the project or stay within the sort of program of work within Good Neighbor. It really does require and helps facilitate close working relationships between state and federal agencies and presumably tribes and counties as well, though they're sort of newer in the game. And just to be really clear here, all work is still must be compliant with NEPA. So the Forest Service or BLM keeps decision-making authority, but the actual sale of timber can be done through the state, and then the project work, implementation work can be done by various partners. So what types of projects are really common? Again, we'll hear specific examples, but veg management generally, timber sales and timber sale prep work, and fire risk reduction thinning. Those are throughout the West, really what we're seeing. Other projects, though, are out there, and there are some really interesting and innovative things. So we'll see more of that, I think, as time goes on. But just to emphasize again, these can be both revenue generating projects. They can also just be service work. So a state agency can simply undertake work for the feds with federal money. Impermissible activities. So it can't really go towards facilities or equipment costs. Recreation generally is not covered, although if you phrase it in terms of restoration, possibly. Prescribed fire and fire generally is people, I would say the federal agency is encouraging different mechanisms for that. New road construction is not permitted, and then simply filling positions, so just salary. So some changes from 2018 for those who've been tracking it for a while. We've seen this change from program income to revenue. And that's really shifted the mechanism of how the authority works. So revenue is retained not by the states, still must be used on Good Neighbor projects, or in theory is returned to the Treasury at the expiration of the agreement. It's also worth noting that that's time limited statutorily, so Congress will have to return to that and re-examine in 2023. So revenue is managed wholly by the states, but it's a cooperative arrangement with the federal agency. That really looks different in different places. And we're seeing sort of emerging systems state to state and region by region. But it is a pretty cooperative and I would say sort of conversational relationship. This isn't money that's controlled solely by the state in the sense that they can't move it out of GNA projects. It can't go towards just buying new trucks for a state agency, for instance. It is transferable between projects, though, within Good Neighbor. So it doesn't, unlike stewardship contracting, it doesn't really have to stay specifically on the footprint of that project. It's also worth noting that there's sort of this emergent model now where, in order to accomplish some of the post-harvest work like brush disposal, pile burning, et cetera, that requires entering into a collections agreement. And that then channels money back to the federal agencies so that they can accomplish some of that work. Tribes and counties, I mentioned that they're also party to the authority. Definitely less work happening there, though there is some, and from what I hear, there's certainly interest. But the Washington office right now isn't allowing the sale of timber because the statute specifically calls for state management of revenue, and so that's really slowing some of those potential partnerships. It's possible that that will change, though. We already saw a proposal in this year in Congress to expand that management of revenue to states and tribes. So putting Good Neighbor in context a little bit, how does it compare with other contracting and agreement pathways? Well, first a caveat, so it's not a zero-sum game, right? The body of work that any given forest is doing doesn't necessarily stay stable. It could be that Good Neighbor really is additive, doesn't necessarily displace. That said, there are different incentives to use Good Neighbor versus other authorities, and so I think it is worth digging into that a little bit. So compared to cooperative agreements, which is often the partnership tool for, say, nonprofits, NGOs, it's worth noting, I think, that GNA doesn't require matching funds, so arguably that makes it less attractive relative to cooperative agreements. But the fact that revenue plays into the overall pot of money available for work definitely probably is a kind of plus for GNA relative to cooperative agreements, which is just a transfer of appropriated funds. Compared to traditional timber sale approaches, there are some things to note here. So obviously a traditional timber sale requires more in-house capacity for the federal agency. What I'm hearing is that Good Neighbor timber sales are often have simpler contracts. They're modeled off of state contracts, although usually slightly modified. So that's generally a plus for industry. Timber sales also generate more by way of trust funds, so KB, BB, which Good Neighbor doesn't. And then from a county perspective and a rural community perspective, we hear a lot about timber sales feeding into county payments in a way that Good Neighbor doesn't. It's worth noting, though, that that's really only applicable in the event that there's an expiration of SRS, which is not currently the case, but that is a program that's always sort of seems to last by the skin of its teeth year to year. Compared to stewardship contracts and agreements, so these are really kind of the workhorse of collaborative conservation work. A lot of collaboratives are involved directly in stewardship contracts or agreements. It's worth noting that stewardship really requires collaboration with collaboratives, I should say, in a way that Good Neighbor doesn't specifically require. So Good Neighbor is a broader tool. It's a partnership tool between state and federal agencies, but there isn't necessarily a nexus for community collaboratives. Stewardship also allows for best value contracting. Ideally, that's really allowing for consideration of local benefits. It's allowing for sort of a broader look at the quality of the work that's being done as well, which Good Neighbor doesn't currently have. Stewardship also has sort of more of a local component to the money, although it's worth noting that depending on if that goes through an IRSC or TC, I won't bog down on those details, but whether it generates retained receipts or not definitely plays into the flexibility and locality of it. Stewardship also definitely has a more complicated bid process, and so industry is probably less excited to see a stewardship project than a Good Neighbor project. And then finally, retained receipts are less flexible than use of Good Neighbor revenue. So there's a potential benefit to both state and federal agencies and the flexibility that Good Neighbor revenue offers. So some high level kind of reflections on Good Neighbor, and then we'll get to hear more about details and hopefully have some Q&A. I think it's worth noting that Good Neighbor really shifts some of the decision making from districts to forests. Traditional timber sales and stewardship as well is really district focused. And that may matter for relationships with collaboratives, depending on sort of your level of engagement with agency partners. And it may matter for local priority setting. It's not inherently good or bad, but just a flag. It's also worth noting that Good Neighbor potentially allows for the use of revenue on other forests than where the project happened. To the best of my knowledge, that's not really happening right now, but there are some interesting possibilities, but also considerations and trade-offs for that local benefit component. And then good neighbor and shared stewardship, just we'll see, I suppose, in a couple of days whether or not we have a change in administration and whether or not we continue to use the phrase shared stewardship. But the general principle and approach to partnership between states and federal agencies probably won't change. And I think it's fair to say that good neighbor is a bit of the sort of engine within the chassis of shared stewardship. It's really how state and federal partners manage cooperative partnerships in on-the-ground projects rather than sort of high-level statements of value. It's also worth noting that it's really still pretty early days for a lot of state programs and engagement in Good Neighbor. It's been years, yes, but when you consider the timeline of project planning and then timber sales and then the actual work on timber sales, it's only been in the last year that most states are really starting to see revenue come in. And so a lot of questions that I've heard from collaborative groups are really hard to answer at the moment. So things like, are these self-sustaining programs? I bet Trevor will have something to say about that, but sort of a problematic term in a variety of ways. Markets fluctuate. It takes years to find out how much money specifically came in from projects. And it also tends to ignore some of the planning costs, which the agency generally, the Forest Service, I should say, generally just sort of holds internally. So it's easy to set expectations really high at this point about what Good Neighbor can do. So I think we are still sort of in a learning phase about it. I do think it's worth noting, though, that it tends to, in my mind, reinforce a kind of commodity framework to restoration in the sense that it's looking for revenue generation from the value of the timber that's being sold. That's a big part of the promise of Good Neighbor. Nothing wrong with that. It works well if you were, say, on the Willamette National Forest. It may not be as appropriate in the context of a dry side forest with, frankly, less valuable trees, right? So it kind of doubles down on that same approach that the agency writ large takes. And I think we're seeing that restoration may take additional inputs of money in a lot of the places that we really want to see it. It's also worth noting that projects really haven't been litigated yet. So the definition of restoration has not really been challenged. And also this note on similar and complementary, for folks who have heard that phrase, it's sort of a question of whether or not work needs to be similar in nature or whether it needs to be geographically aligned, essentially. The agency said that it's really more just similar in nature. I've heard some rumblings of pushback on that, but we don't know because it's litigated. And then finally, the role of collaboration in Good Neighbor is really still evolving. So I think our other presenters will speak to that about how it's actually happening on the ground. But it's largely based on relationships. There's no statutory requirement. And so I'd say for the collaborative members who are on this call, the time to influence that and the nature of that relationship is really right now. And with that, I will end it, but pass it over to other presenters.
Thanks so much, Tyson. We will have 1 or 2 minutes of Q&A, and then we will move on to an Oregon update from Kyle Sullivan at ODF and Sarah Altemus-Pope from the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative. So we do have one question right now. Why are trees or timber less valuable from east side forests versus west side? Is it simply due to size?
I guess probably some of the other presenters could do a better job of explaining the details, but it's pretty complicated. It's size, it's species, it's distance to mill, so a lot of different components, as well as, frankly, just international timber prices, which are going to fluctuate for everyone.
We have a second question here. Are you seeing states report out on the budgets for GNA, especially the revenue?
Good question. Yeah, so that's a question that I've asked state folks. It varies state to state. I think that revenue tracking is still really emerging. Right now, I think regional offices and states are starting to sort of have shared revenue tracking, but most states they're doing some sort of report back to their legislatures, but it's not necessarily really detailed or publicly available necessarily, but that's pretty variable. I know Washington's done a really good job of putting out occasional updates. Idaho has as well. So I would ask state folks if they can share some of that info.
All right, we have one more and then we'll move on to our Oregon update. If counties can't engage in timber sales, where does the revenue come from to fund work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it really is that promise of potential revenue that allows for most Good Neighbor projects to get traction. And so It's not that counties can't partner with the Forest Service, but it's just a use of Forest Service appropriated funds at the moment if they want to. That said, I actually suspect that there are ways that states and counties could work together to manage. The state may still manage the revenue, but a county could potentially do the sale. And I believe there's an early example of county partnership in Washington, so maybe Trevor could talk to that a little more.
Thanks, Tyson. We do have some other questions, but we're going to save those till the end of today so we can get through our two other topics for today, Oregon and Washington, and perhaps some of your questions will be answered through the next presentation. So welcome, Kyle and Sarah. You have screen sharing abilities, so jump in whenever you're ready.
Thanks, guys. And yes, I will start to share my screen here. Okay. All right, great. Well, I'll just jump right in. So I'm Kyle Sullivan with Oregon Department of Forestry, and I am the acting federal forest restoration program lead for the department. And my role essentially is to help deploy the state's resources to accelerate the pace, scale, and quality of forest restoration on our federal forest lands in Oregon. And developing and managing good neighbor projects are a key component of that job. So I'm excited to be able to share some examples of G&A projects in Oregon. I did want to sort of provide the Oregon context and a little bit of a brief background on the authority. As Tyson mentioned, it was first authorized in 2014, and it's a permanent authority that allows the states to implement restoration projects on federal land using both federal or state funds. And in essence, this allows the states to take on an implementation role for projects on federal land. And our governor, Governor Brown, signed Oregon's master G&A agreement with the Forest Service in March of 2016. So that's sort of the start date for us here in Oregon as it relates to the Forest Service. So I did want to show this slide, and it sort of shows the structure of these good neighbor agreements. Like I mentioned, the master agreement is a statewide agreement with the Forest Service that we have. It's a 10-year agreement and started back in 2016. And so underneath that, we have these supplemental project agreements or SPAs. And they essentially, we have roughly 35 of those in Oregon statewide. And those are where the project specific details are outlined and how these projects are funded. But as you can see, there's sort of two different types of these agreements. And again, Tyson touched on this, but essentially there's two different types, and the difference is how they're funded. Sort of in those green boxes, you have the timber spas, and those are funded through revenue generated from the commercially viable products or saw timber produced from a restoration project. And then you have the restoration services spas, and they rely on either congressionally appropriated trust fund, Forest Service trust fund dollars or state funds to fund the work under those agreements. But timber spas are sort of essentially kind of where the real magic is with G&A, because restoration work is able to be completed without congressional appropriation or state general fund money because of these G&A timber sale receipts. So this diagram I wanted to throw in there just to show the cyclical nature of these good neighbor projects and how it can be sort of a sustainable addition to the Forest Service program of work where there is some timber value. But essentially the way these works is there's some injection of state or US Forest Service seed funds. So in Oregon's case, it came from both State General Fund and Forest Service Region 6 funding, and that initiates these agreements and it establishes them. G&A timber sales or commercial restoration projects then have the ability to pay for state costs to prepare and administer these projects, implement non-commercial restoration services work, and conduct the NEPA analysis necessary to generate another commercial restoration projects, therefore continuing the cycle there. So again, this diagram just highlighting that. So I did want to show the importance of retaining a portion of that good neighbor timber revenue for NEPA analysis and planning, so that the cycle can continue. And so this cycle is kind of why in many states, including Oregon, Good Neighbor is viewed as a long-term program and not only an authority. So how is G&A helping the Forest Service meet land management objectives in Oregon? This diagram shows how both ODF and Forest Service's objectives are intersecting, and how G&A could be the tool to meet those objectives. Both the Forest Service and ODF have missions that intentionally do not define jurisdictional boundaries. The Forest Service's mission of sustaining the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests, and Oregon's mission to protect, manage, and promote stewardship of Oregon's forests. Both missions intersect and encompass all of Oregon's 30 million acres of forest land. So the integration of agency missions shows the importance of the use of G&A in meeting both agencies' missions and objectives. So how are we specifically addressing these objectives? This is a few examples of how these G&A projects are being used and have been used in Oregon. You got NEPA all the way, thinning commercial and non-commercial and other projects. And again, G&A is an implementation tool like a service contract or a stewardship contract, and can be used for a wide variety of projects. So next, I'm going to highlight an example of a G&A project that was implemented here in Oregon. This was the first G&A timber sale on the Willamette National Forest, and it involved a commercial thinning for forest health and fuels reduction. So this was called Kane G&A timber sale, and it was prepared and administered by Oregon Department of Forestry Federal Forest Restoration staff. And it was a NEPA ready project, meaning the Forest Service had already completed the NEPA as a part of the project. And the project itself involved the thinning of a second growth forest, which is a standard of treatment among West Side collaboratives. And it was a smaller starter sale that involved the treatment of 26 acres to reduce density, leaving the largest and healthiest trees. And it was designed to make Forest Service lands more resilient to fire and improve stand health. The project also produced roughly 500,000 board feet of timber. So this is just another picture of the stand before and after treatment. So some folks might be wondering, after the sale is sold and the timber is hauled, revenue comes in that could be spent across the Willamette National Forest, as according to our agreement with them, the Good Neighbor Agreement. So this next slide shows the G&A revenue that was generated in federal fiscal year 2019, and shows how it was spent. There was 3 timber sales sold in that federal fiscal year, Kane and a couple other ones. But again, this is the visual of the G&A timber sales sold in that fiscal year. A little bit more than 3 million board feet was sold, and about half of that was harvested and hauled that fiscal year. And this generated almost $700,000, just short of $700,000 in G&A program revenue for the Willamette National Forest. And so this middle portion here sort of shows how that money has been spent to date. But A small portion has been used to offset ODF's costs for personnel, supplies, et cetera, to prepare and administer these projects. In this example, it's 10% roughly, but will fluctuate based on project complexity, resource need, and revenue generated. But the rest is available to be spent across on restoration needs across the forest. So in this middle portion is what projects have been spent on. A significant portion has been allocated to piloting a contract NEPA project called Wall Creek on the Willamette. Also significant portion on stand exams and sale preparation that increase the pace of project implementation. But another sizable portion, roughly 162,000, was allocated on projects that were recommended and prioritized by the local collaboratives and U.S. Forest Service district staff. And so another thing I wanted to show with this diagram, just to show where the collaboratives were engaged in this G&A process. So sort of both in the NEPA planning process in Wall Creek, this contract NEPA, and also how these G&A revenues were spent on recommendations on projects for monitoring noxious weed treatments and fuels reduction projects. And I also wanted to note that G&A sales in this fiscal year and the additional state capacity helped the forest exceed their timber target for that fiscal year. So good neighbor authority and engaging with the collaborative. So for this, for the contracted NEPA CE that ODF conducted and performed under G&A, the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative was engaged via a public meeting that described ODF's involvement and the need for the proposed forest thinning project. The project involved ODF contracting with Nature's Capital LLC, who completed the analysis documentation and draft decision memo for this 65-acre selective thinning. It was actually a similar treatment to what we saw in that Kane G&A example. But specialists from the contracted team shared information with the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative during the public meeting on existing forest conditions and proposed activities, while also reporting on specific findings related to wildlife, aquatics, et cetera there. The Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative was able to engage in detailed discussion with the analysis team, the contracted analysis team. A main part of the public meeting involved a field trip to the project area to allow collaborative members to ask questions and better understand the current conditions of the project area. Overall, an excellent opportunity for the collaborative members to learn more about contracted NEPA under G&A. And also, as mentioned before, another way that collaboratives engaged was to provide input and recommendations on what projects to spend that timber sale revenue on. So in closing here, I just wanted to provide some opportunities and challenges for Oregon and G&A, Oregon's use of G&A moving forward. Some opportunities are to, like I mentioned, continue to contract NEPA work and do more projects similar to what we did for Wall Creek. Expand the use of G&A to areas where it hasn't been done to date, Forest Service districts or BLM districts that is not being used. Expand the project types, so possibly doing some contract environmental assessments. Stream restoration hasn't been done to date. Just other project types, restoration projects under a good neighbor authority. And also just refining the approaches to producing NEPA-ready acres, such as finding solutions to heritage surveying bottlenecks or investing in efficiency solution, surveying efficiency solutions such as eDNA surveying. Some challenges are, and this is not unique to Oregon, but matching limited ODF staffing capacity with the federal need is certainly a challenge for us and for a lot of states using this authority. Also for us in Oregon, and this was alluded to in Tyson's presentation, but the Eastern and Central Oregon high restoration need forests with low commercial value per acre in finding the funds to pay for that restoration work. County budget concerns is a definite challenge with the use of Good Neighbor Authority. And also just the federal and state lack of comfortability, underdeveloped guidance with the authority. However, there is some additional Forest Service guidance, Region 6 Forest Service guidance that's going to be released very soon. So hopefully that'll help. But that's all that I had. I just leave you guys with some resources to learn a little bit more. Our website, the Ecosystem Workforce Programs website that's monitoring, that provides monitoring for our program, and then my contact information.
Thanks so much, Kyle. Before we jump to Sarah, we have just a couple questions for you, Kyle. The first is, in GNA in Oregon, do any of the funds go back to the county, or is that not required as it is for timber sales? And is that explicitly shown in the agreement or in operational practice?
Yeah, so my understanding of the statute, the Good Neighbor Authority, is that it's not allowed to give money to the counties. And so it hasn't been done to date for any GNA timber sales. Great.
And then our second question is, how was the GNA revenue crosswalked with NEPA service work for the project that you're explaining a moment ago, the restoration that isn't timber harvest, before it's considered for other options?
How was it crosswalked? I guess I don't really understand what they mean by that.
So I think what we're getting at is how, let me see. I think the best way for me to do this would be to unmute Trent, whose question it is. Trent, do you want to go ahead and ask your question to Kyle? You can unmute yourself.
Thanks. Kyle, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just wondering, in the NEPA analysis and the decision notice from the Forest Service, it includes restoration work that was going to be covered with the revenue from timber sales. So when it's a GNA project, how does the Forest Service and the ODF, and then if a collaborative is involved, decide what part of that money from the GNA revenue is going to be kept there on the project to do aquatics, riparian restoration, meadow restoration, other things that are service work before it's considered, let's just say, to fund monitoring on a different part of the forest or to set up a GNA project?
Yeah, and I think the priority certainly is implementing the restoration treatments within the footprint of the actual thinning first, and then sort of addressing needs across the forest with the remainder of that revenue. So and like I mentioned, some of that's going to be allocated, and we don't have exact percentages on this. 33% should be spent on contract NEPA and 5% on other projects. So that really hasn't been I guess formally designated, but it's like I said, we there is a significant portion that was made available for recommendation to the collaboratives and the local Forest Service districts to see what priority projects that they want to spend that money on.
Great.
Maybe I can jump in and help answer that a little bit too. That the collaborative was involved in discussions about that project, and we're always looking for efficiencies on what is part of that contract. And definitely with the CEO is a learning opportunity. I could talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, that was our last question. So why don't we pass it over to you, and you can talk some more about an example project.
Great. As I'm sharing my screen, can you give me a time check? How much time do I have here for this presentation, Sally?
We got about 10 minutes
About 10.
with a couple more for questions.
Okay, yeah, I'll try and get through this in about 5 to 7 so I can answer questions. So hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Ultimus Pope. I'm the coordinator for the Southern Willamette Forest Collaborative, and we are, there we go, located in Oak Ridge, Oregon, a small collaborative here. We work primarily with the Middle Fork District of the Willamette National Forest, and we've been active since 2014. We're one of 4 forest collaboratives on the Willamette National Forest, and we talk about restoration projects in the entire upper Middle Fork Willamette watershed. So this is some of our partners or stakeholders that engage in our collaborative discussions on a variety of our committees, and it's a pretty diverse group. And collaborative restoration is how our collaboratives work with land managers to advance restoration goals for the places that they work in. And I like to share this slide about what we try to achieve with our restoration projects is that triple bottom line that everybody hears about. And I think this is something that collaboratives can bring to this discussion around GNA, is helping for GNA projects to deliver on these goals. So the social and cultural objectives, which allow for public participation and bringing in the values of stakeholders and empowering local communities, ecological objectives around resilience and integrity and function of our ecosystems, and the economic objectives around the local economies, growth, equity, and who gets the work, and looking for efficiencies in doing that work. So forest collaboratives help build agreement around public land management actions through multi-party shared learning and trust building, and help support or coordinate planning processes at various scales. So this could be at the NEPA planning scale with landscape planning and project planning, or on the back end, such as our collaborative is also engaged in on implementation through stewardship and GNA. And then also collaboratives are very much involved and interested in the monitoring of those projects to see if they achieve the outcomes that we desire. So this is how our collaborative is organized. And I like to share this because we do split the work out into committees. So there's a small steering committee that really focuses on administration, but there's also these other implementation advisory committee and rigged and collaboration committee that work on the bulk of the collaborative partner work that we focus on. So I'm going to talk to you today about the implementation advisory committee. So this committee really focuses on the back end implementing projects. So already NEPA has been done, and this group looks at stewardship and GNA and restoration. Is bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders to engage in field trips and learning sessions and roundtables to come to consensus around any recommendations or input they'd like to give towards these projects to help achieve that triple bottom line. And so really what this group is focusing on is these different funding mechanisms. So when we have these monthly meetings around implementation with the Implementation Advisory Committee, we talk about all these different streams. So GNA projects that are happening on the district and the funding that's going into those and coming out of those, similarly with stewardship, and then also partner grants. So those stakeholders, several of them bring in significant funds into the watershed for restoration work. So we like to talk in whole about all these different funding mechanisms. So we're looking at where are the gaps, where can we use one authority to get restoration work done that another authority might not cover. We do this through recommendation memos to our agency partners. And then I'll talk a little bit about the projects that Kyle touched on. So on the Middle Fork District, there's been these different timber sales that have brought in revenue through the sales. And then on the back end, so this would not be the projects that are part of the contract, but the revenue that comes from it, there's been a variety of projects that have been funded. So mostly around building capacity and doing more work, the NEPA planning through the CE, and then a couple of projects that I will talk about here shortly. So Wall Creek Thin that Kyle talked about, what was great about that project is it was not only a learning opportunity for the collaborative, it really was for the district. It's the first time the district had done something like this on a CE and really handing over the whole CE. So the field trip that we had and working with the contract group, which was 5 different business entities that came together to perform that, it was a great opportunity for them to learn more about what the collaborative all the different stakeholders' interests are in the project, and also to have those in-depth discussions with the district on doing that work. And we intend to continue to track that entire project to look at, you know, the efficiencies around it and the cost effectiveness of using this mechanism. And then a couple of the projects that were funded through GNA revenue that came available last year was the Pinegrass Plantation Habitat Improvement Project. This is a project that's been ongoing for years, but routinely underfunded. The work is still always there. So, and that's a picture in one of those pine grass plantations where the work had been done. And so some of the revenue was set aside from one of the timber sales and dedicated to this project, and staffing ODF firefighters and off-season work. So I think they're doing that work right now to get some of that thinning done. And then the Jims Creek post-implementation monitoring project, that was a really important opportunity for the collaborative group to bring in University of Oregon to do transect monitoring on transects for a pilot project that's an important project for a larger planning area that we're working on, and to really capture the lessons learned on whether or not that pilot project achieved all the outcomes that the partners were hoping was one of the first stewardship projects. And that will result in published documents and presentations to the collaborative, and the lessons learned from this monitoring will be directly rolled into implementation of more similar projects that are going to come out of that region planning area. And last, one of the things I'd like to point out that I think the collaborative can bring to engaging with the agencies on using these tools, the GNA and stewardship, is really the collaborative helps hold that institutional knowledge about the restoration priorities and goals for the watershed and for the area. Just in our 5 years, we've seen turnover at various line positions, our timber staff officer, we're on our 3rd NEPA planner. And then we've also seen turnover with our ODF staff with FFR. And so I think that one of the values that we can hold is to keep these projects going throughout transitions. And when there are transitions, provide a team of people that, you know, a new hire can plug into and be able to efficiently keep doing the work we're trying to do. And I think that's it, Sally. I can take questions or questions for Kyle too.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sarah. So our first question is ODF funding the collaborative directly with GNA revenue funds for project monitoring?
They aren't funding their collaborative, they're funding University of Oregon. So yeah, it went to one of the partners of the collaborative group to do that work.
Right, and we'll give it a minute or two.
Yeah, ODF is providing support to the collaboratives through state funds, but not Good Neighbor Authority funds.
Right, it doesn't look like there are other questions yet, but it takes everyone a minute to type them in. So why don't we move on to Washington, and then I'd like at the end of this session to have both Oregon and Washington come together and we can answer questions as a whole. All right, so let's switch over to Trevor McConkey and Brian Bailey from Washington DNR.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I'm going to get my screen up here. All right. So, hi, everybody. I'm Trevor McConkey. I'm the Federal Lands Assistant Division Manager of our Forest Health and Resiliency Division at the Washington DNR. And Today I'm going to be speaking with you with Brian Bailey about basically how our program is working and sort of brief history on the program, as well as sort of ways that collaboratives can work with Good Neighbor and then some current projects we're doing. And Brian, you can introduce yourself.
Okay, hey everybody. Like Trevor said, I'm Brian Bailey. I'm the implementation and planning lead for Washington's Federal Lands Program. Just happy to be here. I want to say thanks to Sally and everybody for putting this together. Thank you, Trevor, for asking me to talk about a few slides today. And if you want to go to the next one, I'll kind of jump in with a little GNA history, kind of set the stage for where Washington is and where we've come from. And like this has been pointed out a couple of times, GNA is pretty new. I think sounds like we got started a little later than Oregon. We signed our master agreement in 2017. We had a bunch of banners hanging from the rafters, some television crews, I believe, had the Commissioner on Public Lands sign that agreement with the regional forester, Jim Pena. But I would say really things got off the ground in 2018. And not just because that's when I was hired, but maybe partially so, because that's when we started bringing on some staff. We've always been a very implementation-focused program, and we really started growing our program, as you can see with that map on the right, starting in 2018. If we look at that really quick, I mean, this is kind of where we are now. You can see we do have staff on every forest, kind of different strategies of how we've built our program based on the forest. But, you know, we did that for a couple of reasons. To get work done on the forest, one, we needed somebody there to do it, but also it was to start building some of these collaborative relationships. That was key, getting somebody local on the forest. So you can see we're pretty spread out. You know, what work have we done in the last year and a half or 2 years? We've done quite a bit. And, you know, Trevor put on here commercial and non-commercial restoration projects statewide. We really have. We've hit on every national forest. We're going to talk a little bit more about those projects coming up. But establishing the projects, the initial projects, which, you know, honestly, a lot of that was commercial at the beginning, and we'll talk a little bit about how our program's transitioning, but we've got those agreements established. We've got commercial and non-commercial projects going on every forest. We've got on this listed 46 projects. And, you know, I think we're up to like 47 million board feet. We've got 2,000 acres of fuel treatments completed already, with another scheduled. And that's sorry about the background noise, but and I'll also just point out what we got here is fund sources from state, federal, and revenue, and that's really like one of the most amazing things about this program. We've hit on a little bit more, but we're going to dive into that today because we're not just talking about making revenue. Those numbers were kind of like productivity numbers, but really it's what can we accomplish and how and some of those tools. So with that, Trevor, you can go to the next slide and cover a few.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think a question that always gets brought up is like, how's this work funded? You know, we took away a lot of the general stuff out of our presentation because we knew that a lot of the other folks were going to be covering that. So we're getting a little bit more pointed about how we do work. So just talking about the 1921 biennium, which is we're in currently and ends June 30th of 2021. We received $2.7 million for state appropriated funds. Federally appropriated funds that are being used at this time are around 2.4 million. And then currently we're estimating timber revenue around 2 to 3 million, sort of for all, that's statewide across all forests. Some forests have a lot more than other ones. It's just kind of how it works. The same thing happens in Oregon and other forests or in other states. So we have two main state funding sources, which is the capital budget. Then we have a small amount of operating, which we're very fortunate to have. The federally appropriated funds are typically tied into the agreements to either come from the forest or the RO. And then the timber receipts are, again, as you've been hearing from everyone else, they're a pretty unique funding source. They're not stewardship retained receipts, it's GNA revenue. And there's limitations on it that are the same way as they would be if they were grant funds, because there are federal dollars. In our state, we have a dedicated revolving account that was established by the legislature to actually hold this revenue so that it could be appropriately accounted for. And we had to do that also to separate basically state trust revenue and this federal revenue. There could never be a mixing of those two, or that would be very bad for a lot of reasons. So again, we're pretty lucky to have those things. And this thing here to the side is sort of like, okay, well, there's just money, like, how's it get out the door? And so really, to like make it very basic, it's like, okay, well, who's going to do the work? Well, either the DNR is going to do the work, or we're going to contract it out. What are we going to do? We're either going to do project planning type work, like stand exams, or maybe at some point like full NEPA, kind of like they're doing down in Oregon. Primarily, it's for project implementation. And then we're going to accomplish that work again. It's, oops, excuse me. It's either going to be, whoop, too far. Hold on, go back. There we go. So we're either going to accomplish that work through, again, we will actually do the work ourselves, or we're going to contract it out. Most of the time, we're going to contract it out, because that is one of the main benefits of Good Neighbor, is using state contracts. I cannot express how important that is for not only programs, but also stakeholders and groups like yourselves within collaboratives, because those state contracts are a powerful mechanism that has efficiencies built into them. So that's something that's just critical to understand, that when you work with Good Neighbor, which we'll get to a little later, that's one of the main benefits you get, is tapping into those state mechanisms. So we're going to go to talking about where we're working with some of the projects and some of the stuff we're doing next.
All right, here we go. So map of Washington with the National Forest highlighted, as well as DNR state trust lands. You can see we've got the yellow triangle for commercial projects, red for non-commercial. You know, we have been trying to, you know, spread out across these forests. Things are a little grouped right now, and that's partially because of the structure of where our people are based, but also just because, again, we've only been in this for a year and a half. We talked a little bit earlier about like forest-wide versus district-wide, and we are really trying to have that forest-wide presence. You know, looking at this map, a couple other things I'd want to point out is, you know, there are a lot of commercial projects listed here. The red number is actually starting to build up, which is excellent to see. You know, we talked about that kind of life cycle of G&A finances with a nice graphic earlier. And, you know, seed money is a very important thing. You know, we talk a lot about the opportunities for revenue, but you've got to build that up first. We have had some excellent resources given to us from the state to do some of this non-commercial work, but for the resiliency of the program itself, we need to have that revenue fund source built up as well before we can really start spinning it, which is where we're kind of at right now. We're getting that bucket built up so we can start exploring those options. You know, another thing to point out here, just because I don't think it's really come up yet, Trevor was talking about different ways of either the program doing the work itself or contracting it out. There's even a couple of different ways for us to do the work, and I think that's important. We can do work by essentially taking it from scratch, you know, maybe post NEPA or not, but taking it and owning it all the way through, you know, during the compliance of the timber sale or thinning or whatever. Or we can just send out a crew to help the Forest Service. And some of that stuff I think is a little harder to quantify the benefit of, but we've actually been able to do a lot of that as well. And it is really important if the Forest Service is absent some pre-sale crew help, we can provide that pretty easily. We're actually trying to diversify our program a little bit to provide the resources that are needed where they're needed. One interesting thing about Washington is, you know, we now have 2 engineers on our staff who have just been super helpful in getting some of our projects done, both commercial and non-commercial. You know, I will point out lonely little Umatilla down there in the bottom right. We've just started conversations with them. As you guys know, that's a forest that is mostly in Oregon and pretty far out of the way for most of our resources in Washington. But we're trying to expand there as well too. BLM is something that's also not on this map, but we just signed an agreement with them as well. And we'll hopefully be working on the BLM pretty soon too. I think that might cover it. Trevor, anything to add about this map?
Yeah, maybe just do like a quick rundown of just some of the types of projects, just a little quick highlight. You know, commercial is one thing, but then just a couple of the other things we're doing.
Yeah, and you know, we'll talk about some of the collaborative projects pretty soon, and those are super interesting. But we actually have a very diverse set of projects already that we can talk about. You know, like on the Olympic, for instance, our first project, it wasn't even a commercial project. It was a stream monitoring. You know, we wanted to expand a stream monitoring project to cross boundaries between state and federal lands. Rock crushing agreements. On the Olympic Peninsula, it rains a lot. If you don't have good rock on the roads, you're going to have sediment delivery and a lot of problems. A lot of the things too that are shown here, but hard to really represent, are when we do restoration projects that are commercial, we actually try to tag on as much non-commercial work as possible too. We're trying to stay within the footprint that came up earlier. Like, that is important in an efficiency way. I mean, if we have equipment for a timber project, there's a lot of non-commercial work that we can get done cheaply in the vicinity, but that's not actually a full like driving principle either. We're really more concerned about getting the work done that we want to versus having a high price paid for that timber. And you can see some of that. I mean, you know, I think one of the projects we're going to talk about later on the Olympic Peninsula, I think we made a whooping like $14,000. But we're doing some incredible fish work associated with that. So AOPs or salmon projects, one of the real big things we're focusing on the west side. Fuels, of course, drive a lot of what we're doing on the east side. I don't know if you guys have heard in the news, but Washington just released their latest forest action plan, which prioritized watersheds on the west side, which, if you combine that with a 20-year strategic plan for wildfire on the east side, now we do have priority areas all across the state that we can focus treatments on and help us coordinate better, not only with the Forest Service, but also the state of Washington and other stakeholders and property owners.
Okay, great. All right, moving on. So discussion point about, there's always this thing about decision making. You know, how are decisions made? Who's making the decision? Is it you make the decision, or are we making the decision? I think it's this thing that is this like this overarching theme. It's a big thing in the stewardship authority work realm because collaboratives have a really important role in the stewardship realm because there is direct involvement with making decisions. The thing about the decision-making process that was kind of described by Kyle is that the overarching kind of decision-making is actually kind of like, it's a little bit more diffuse is the way I'll describe it. So although there isn't like legal authority in there for collaboratives to make decisions, there's absolutely a social, cultural sort of decision-making place. And so that really comes into what Brian talked about, which is having our staff be participating in collaboratives as just a resource for collaboratives when they're going through decision-making, because we can always take on stewardship-like projects. They get converted into Good Neighbor, but they still accomplish the same goals. We just do it differently using the state process. So the project ideas and discussions are happening all the time, as you do in your collaboratives. Meanwhile, there's also this project ideas and discussions happening between the DNR and the Forest Service. And that's happening just on our own, trying to help them out with their priorities, all those things. Meanwhile, at the same time, stuff's happening with DNR, USF, and the collaboratives. The whole time there's talk about what's going on. But the key point is it has to be put into an agreement so that it has the legal precedence to do the work. And that agreement is sort of between the DNR and the Forest Service. And the idea, though, is that if we're going to be doing collaborative work, it will be basically decided in that sort of decision-making process that's sort of below that everyone's on board with it. And then we finally get to project execution. I think the good thing to understand is that good neighbor authority is not the stewardship authority. So you can't think about it that way. You have to think just differently about it. So kind of try to get through here quickly. How do collaboratives access the GNA? Well, again, as I said, you need to have an attachment into the programs, whether it's Oregon or Washington. There's got to be some venue for discussion to happen. One of the first things that's going to get asked if a GNA gets brought up as an idea is like, is it the right thing? It's not always the right thing. There's a lot of times the stewardship authority is a way better way to go, and like we encourage that. And then again, if the collaborative is recommending something and they want to do it through Good Neighbor, there's an assumption that the Forest Service will support that idea. But then what it really comes down to is like, okay, cool, everyone likes it. Then we got to go, can we do it? Like the program, can we actually do it? Do we have enough money to do it? Do we have our own capacity? Does it meet the intent of GNA as well as sort of broader priorities like Brian sort of talked about with Forest Action Plan, Forest Health 20-year plan, and kind of the shared stewardship discussion? Does it meet all those things? Because sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's really just focused on something that's more remnant. And then finally, after that all gets gone through, then we get to the place where we actually agree upon the project, and then we design and actually get the modification or the SPA in place to do the work. And that then outlines how we're going to fund it, the cost of it, all that stuff, all the technical details. So I think this is a big part. Why should collaboratives care? Like, why does this matter to you guys? Well, y'all are here today, so that means you're obviously are interested in it, but let's talk about why you really should be thinking about it. So as I said earlier, when you work with a state agency, the whole basis of Good Neighbor is tapping into efficiencies of the state. Someone in Congress had an idea that said the states do pretty much the same work the Forest Service does, but if they do it cheaper and faster, why can't we just do the same thing on fed lands as long as we're not breaking federal law, NEPA, and all those things? So they created the Good Neighbor Authority as a way to do that, a way to allow the process of the state to be used on federal land to accomplish the same outcomes. So again, access to efficiencies and processes, accessing different skill sets. The states do things differently than the feds. That doesn't mean it's wrong. I think it's really, I found it's common that just because we do something in process to get to the end point that's different, people assume it's wrong. And that's not correct. That's not how the authority works. It's the outcome that needs to be the same. We bring additional funding sources to the table that may not be there, like we talked about with our state capital. And then I think the big thing for collaboratives is that if you do tap into the state, by nature, there's going to be an economic return on that investment. And that I think is really important to understand, because we only got 14 people in our program and we have one person on a forest versus having a whole bunch of people helping to get a project across the line. We're just cheaper because we're smaller, but you also tie into those state efficiencies. And then the shared stewardship function and the connectivity, using Good Neighbor is part of a broader narrative, and that the stewardship authority, shared stewardship, the bigger plans out there are part of it. What's not good about working with the state? Well, it's not the stewardship authority. It's the first part. So the relationship is different in terms of collaboratives. You don't tap into that retained receipt discussion. It's a bit more autonomous thinking between the DNR and the Forest Service. But we absolutely want to hear recommendations on projects from the collaborative. There's another step in decision making, which now the state has a vested sort of position to say, no, we're going to do that, or yes, we are. And I think a big thing for everyone to understand is the authority has changed 3 times since it was really taken off in 2016, 2014. that timeline between 2016 and 2018, there's been 3 significant changes to the authority, which Tyson hit on. It's not done changing, folks. It's going to keep changing. And that's a really difficult operating space for states. And finally, limitations on state staff and funding is just always there, as it is with everybody. It's one tool, not always the best tool.
Okay, I think one of the great things about what Trevor was just talking about is that it's not hypothetical. Like we actually have been doing this and have had pretty good partnerships with collaboratives over the last couple of years. And this slide highlights quite a few of those projects, but not even all of them. You know, I think there's a couple different ways we can work with the collaborative. And one is that we kind of agree to a contract, like in a contract with them, that we will do some work, then they can get funding for that. You know, we haven't taken funding from third-party sources, but we have been involved with collaboratives as they've reached out to the state for state funding and grants. So Mount Baker, Snoqualmie, they've got a state collaborative grant funding that they have partnered with us, and we were in discussions with them throughout the process to say, like, okay, if you want to get this grant to get this work done, we can contribute by essentially being a contractor for these stand exams. We've done that.
Stop you for a quick second.
Yeah.
You have a lot of background noise going on, and so it's difficult to hear your voice over what's happening in the back. Maybe we could take a pause for a moment, or
I'm sorry, maybe Trevor, do you want to handle this? I've got kind of an open work environment here.
Yeah, Brian's in a small apartment, 2 people working. Yeah, it's okay. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick. So currently we've worked with 3 collaboratives. However, we are working with most of the collaboratives in the state. Actual projects that we've gone through an agreement process, sort of mutually agreeing upon helping with work, are these 3 collaboratives. I do want to note that I got the sale name wrong and the collaborative wrong on the Gifford Pinchot. It's the Pinchot Partners and the Wake Sale. So, and that's actually the triangles that are just north of that circle. So sorry, I was doing this at about 12 o'clock last night. So, okay, so on the Olympic National Forest, I think it's important to know we did a project called the Queets Corner Project. This was a project that the collaborative was sort of taking full force to help move the project along. It was running into a lot of sort of like roadblocks and just issues with sort of working with the Forest Service. They were trying to figure out how they were going to auction it out. And so we kind of offered up our help, like, hey, we can basically go finish up the layout and then get the contract out and everything. But the big thing that this sale did was it was tied into a state lands function, which is there was a fish pipe that needed to be pulled, or sorry, a culvert that needed to be pulled for a fish-bearing stream due to RMAP requirements for state lands. So we were able to combine sort of bringing in good neighbor into the discussion, using the mechanisms of the state to move that sale forward and accomplish that work to allow for the state to pull that pipe. And great partnership, Olympic region for the DNR and Olympic National Forest and GNA and the collaborative. It all just worked really well. So again, that project is like $14,000 in revenue. So it was more about the project than the revenue, and that's an important thing to understand with our program, as we do look at things that way. Mount Baker Snoqualmie, working with the Darrington Collaborative. We had a similar situation with the Siegelson 2.0 sale. Working with the Northwest region, we were able to complete a project and take it across the finish line to have a successfully sold sale for the Mount Baker. It was, I think, their only, Brian, nod your head, was it the only sale for them that year? I think, yeah, so that was important. And then we have this North Fork Stilly stand exam thing. So part of that NEPA planning discussion, we are involved in it, but very pointed parts. So that was doing upwards of like 9,000 acres of stand exams to help move a NEPA process forward. And then again, the Gifford Pinchot Forest and the Pinchot Partners, that was actually tied into a state grant program that we have, similar to Oregon, but a little bit more focused on sort of the outputs. And the output for that grant request was to complete that collaboratively supported timber sale, which we did. and it came in at a very successful bid rate of like 36% overbid, and is currently operating and developing revenue for the forest. So great partnerships, excellent opportunities, just some examples of how we can work with folks. There was the right alignment of resources, funding, and opportunity to do the work. So let me finish up here super quick. What's ahead and what should collaboratives think about? Well, in Washington, and we're going to focus on that discussion, but also other collaboratives throughout Oregon, it's sort of that connection of how you guys fit into the bigger picture. And collaboratives are a really important part of accomplishing work on federal lands. And Good Neighbor is a tool for you to access to accomplish your goals that you're trying to. The shared stewardship function that's now happening in both states. Brian mentioned the Forest Action Plan and the Forest Health 20-year plan. Those are like really important things to look about for geography and doing work, because connecting things across the landscape, not just federal, but federal, state, and private, really does create a really important narrative. As we said, Eastern Washington, we're focusing on those acreage targets for the Forest Health 20-year plan. Resiliency to sort of wildfire and communities at risk kind of stuff. Western Washington is looking at habitat, specifically like a lot of salmon restoration type work, watershed health. That's tied into the Forest Action Plan. And then the big one is boosting those rural economies through doing those commercial projects and the associated stewardship work or service work, whatever you want to call it. And the federal lands program, just so you guys understand, it's gone through a phase of growth project. We're moving out of the stabilization phase into the refinement phase, which means we have staff who are on forests, who are going to be long-term positions. We're moving into figuring out where we need to turn the knobs to get the program to function at a really high level while still maintaining a fairly low program cost. And then the last thing I want you all to be aware of is that there's the 21-23 capital budget request. There's about $8.2 million requested for federal lands work. That's both with collaboratives through Good Neighbor and supporting kind of that broad need that's out there that y'all are familiar with. So with that, I'll kind of end and we'll end there.
Thanks so much, Trevor and Brian and Kyle, Sarah, and Tyson. Why don't we all come together? And there's questions for all of you at this point. So we'll just have a group question and answer. So to start, let's go with the Washington first, and then we'll work our way backwards. But let's see. So I had it right in front of me. Sorry, too many things happening at once. So this is for you, Trevor. When you mentioned that GNA revenue is federal funding, can you clarify? There was some understanding that it became state money, but had restrictions to stay within the program. But can it be used broadly?
Yeah. So revenue is still currently, it's still restricted on certain requirements within those agreements. So even though you heard Tyson talk about sort of cooperative agreements and all of those sort of things, there's still basically OMB rules that are overseeing it. For example, I think the biggest one that we can talk about is that like equipment purchases is a really big part of it, because you can have $1 million in revenue, but you couldn't buy a pickup truck with that revenue. For example, you can buy equipment which up to $5,000. So you can't buy like these key program function equipment you need to go do work out in the woods. A lot of agencies have struggled with that around the country. It's great to have a bunch of revenue, but the purpose of it is to get out for work on the ground. So when you're trying to build a program, it's really difficult. So that's kind of, I think, what I was trying to describe when I said that, is that it's still sort of treated as if it's grant dollars, because we still have to report on it. And we still have to basically track it and report the same way that we would if it was grant dollars being expended. The difference being, it's not a, here's your grant, sort of like subtracting down, it's just how much revenue has been spent sort of on that reporting period.
Thanks. So this is back to Oregon. Is there potential for GNA to support wildfire restoration and recovery?
I certainly think there is, and we, at least on the Willamette, will be potentially using some Good Neighbor revenue to do do some reforestation work. We haven't solidified exactly what specifically we're going to be doing, but there is that ability for areas of the state where we have good neighbor timber revenue built up already. And so that will be available to the forest to spend for that work.
Thanks, Kyle. So we do have just a clarifying question as well. Maybe one of you can choose who takes this, but what's the difference between commercial and non-commercial restoration project? And could you give me an example of each?
Essentially, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but if the material has any residual value left over after the treatment, after a thinning, for instance, then it would be considered commercial. I mean, if there's $1 of surplus, I mean, I guess you can consider that particular project commercial. But yeah, examples of a commercial project are a thinning where saw material is being sold and there's value there to be had. Non-commercial, it would be maybe some for thinning. In the thinning realm, it would be maybe thinning non-merchantable trees that are small trees that don't have a market yet.
I'll simplify that even more. Basically, if there is a revenue function where you're generating revenue, and that's what's happening with it, it's commercial. If you are just flat out spending money to do the work, it's non-commercial. Doesn't matter what it is. And that also goes for if we're supporting the Forest Service to conduct a project that they will take into sort of a commercial project that we're not, as Brian said, I say soup to nuts, right? Or we lead and we support projects. If we're just supporting them for them to complete a timber project, that still counts as commercial because it's contributing to that process.
Thanks, Trevor. So Tyson, but maybe everyone as well. This is about the timing for GNA timber sales, meaning can the sold timber stand for 7 to 10 years like traditional timber sales, or do the sales go through more quickly?
It's a good question. I think I'll pass it over to Trevor or Kyle. I imagine it depends on the state timber sale contract.
Brian, do you want to take that one?
It might be noisy in the background, so I'll let you. It's really up to us and how long we think the timber sale is going to take to get done. We like to speed them up because when we're talking about the financial picture and planning and staffing and everything, if we can count on that revenue being brought back in 2 years versus 5 years, that makes a really big difference. You can take it from there, Trevor.
Yeah. Furthermore, because in Washington, at least, it's probably different in Oregon. We don't follow forest practices, okay, which is exempted from state lands. That doesn't mean we don't do protections, okay. We follow NEPA, which arguably can be more protective than forest practices. So that review process plus state lands has to go through a Board of Natural Resources review process for their sales, which is rightfully so. That cuts off almost 2 to 3 months of time in the processing of a sale. So we have the ability to go through the full layout and get it going and get it out on the market fairly quickly. I think the biggest thing that takes time is the back and forth between the Forest Service to make sure that we're meeting all the objectives of the NEPA.
Great.
Yeah, and going back, just very quickly, just going back to the flexibility that Trevor was talking about with our contracting procedures. I mean, the gist of it is we have the flexibility to kind of set it for as long or as short as appropriate.
Thanks, Kyle. Our next question is for both Washington and Oregon. What are the current hurdles and barriers to GNA expansion, and what can stakeholders do to help overcome them?
Go, Kyle, go.
And we both hit on it. It's the capacity. It's the human capital, the human person, the people on the ground getting the work done. We're in Oregon, and I think Washington too, are restricted by the legislative position authority to hire staff. We don't just need to provide the funding in order to hire staff. We also need to meet the threshold of getting that position authority to hire permanent staff to do this type of work. And that's a huge obstacle for us in expanding its use.
I think I'll add in here too, a role the collaboratives can play is just helping to educate about the authority and how it's used. So we've hosted a legislator tour in the past around stewardship before or as GNA was starting to spool up to show legislators what it looks like on the ground, projects beforehand, after with partners. And then we've also talked about trying to host tours for nearby county commissioners who are skeptical about GNA and inviting them over similarly to do a tour and see how it works on the Willamette.
Yeah, I think both of those discussions are there. I think, depending on how sort of micro you want to get on it, is there's a cultural barrier that exists with sort of the concept of change. That's the way I'll sort of put it, right? Like, this thing's different, and it's becoming not different because we're now like 3 years into it. But anytime you try to do something that's radically different than the normal way, there's just an immediate rear back distrust, uncomfortableness with it. The only way that we can get beyond that is by doing the best that we can to prove the intent of the authority and what it's really for. I think there's sort of just this nefariousness that exists in these things that are sort of unknown to people. That's why I'm glad there's a lot of people on this call today. That goes both internally within the Forest Service, as well as internally within the state agencies, as well as externally with stakeholders and the public. I mean, the first thing you're going to get when someone hears that DNR is going to go do a timber sale on federal lands is it's going to look like a DNR sale. And it's like, actually, no, it's not going to look anything like a DNR sale because we have to follow NEPA. We don't follow our HCP, which they do on state lands in certain parts of the state. So those things are really like big undertones that exist. And the best thing that we can do is work with folks like yourselves. And just like Sarah said, it's help telling the story and looking at successes. Because we're not always going to get everybody to come along with us, and that's okay. And there's sort of a breaking point or a limit for GNA for sort of where it's there. There's a piece of the pie for GNA is the way I would sort of describe it, as there is for stewardship, as there is for normal sort of general Forest Service work. So being able to figure out what that piece of the pie looks like is different in every state. And so getting it to that right size is going to be the biggest challenge, because nobody knows what that is right now. Nobody knows how big should these programs get, how much should we do. It's very nebulous right now.
And I would just add a quick thing there. I mean, this isn't without a transaction cost for the Forest Service either. So this takes grants and agreement staff to administer a Good Neighbor program on their side of it. So I think it's worth flagging that maybe it's not a problem right now, but I know grants and agreements are stretched pretty thin. And as we see a new Forest Service budget structure that controls salary and expenses as its own line item, this may at some point also require sort of buy-in from Congress, or at least Washington office leadership, to make staff available to do the agreements work.
Great. Our next question is, how do both states view the additionality of GNA work? There are concerns existing in the Forest Service or concerns exist with the Forest Service may reduce their expenditures if the states are bringing non-federal dollars to the table.
Kind of a weird question. So, yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Well, and this is something that Trevor mentioned before, but I think it's worth highlighting again. I mean, you're tapping into a lot of state match funds. We fund, we have 6 staff across the state. About 4 of those or 5 of those are fully state funded. So you're tapping into state resources, state funds. And also the increased efficiencies in the state contracting procedures, and ultimately resulting in a lower cost to get the same end result. So reiterate both those critical pieces and benefits of GNA.
And maybe some clarification, it was additionality with the concern internally within the Forest Service that we're going to impact their expenditures by bringing funds in. Is that what I was hearing someone say?
Let's see if there's a clarification. That's how I read it, but Matt, do you want to clarify? You're welcome to unmute yourself.
Okay, hopefully can you hear me?
Yep.
So the question, I mean, I guess the concern was with states bringing state dollars to the table to conduct Forest Service work, the concern that the Forest Service would then spend what limited dollars they have in other places, and this really wouldn't get more work done, would just result in the same level of work, but with the states basically funding the federal programs level, you know, their responsibilities for work.
Yeah, I think that's a valid discussion, and there's an accountability component that needs to be brought into it, not necessarily on the state side, but on the Forest Service side. A great example I have is the trust funds. And like we go through a negotiation with the Forest Service on where we're going to spend the revenue that would have been used for trust fund dollars. And they want to show me where that's going to be used. And my sort of response to them is like, you show me where you're going to use it. Like, if we're giving it back to you, I want to see that get put on the ground. So that's kind of an accountability thing that's tough, because it's really easy to get pointed at and told that, you know, you need to show me every single dollar, when we can kind of throw it right back and say, you got to do the same thing. In addition to that, there's a discussion about making sure that the way that they determine those rates must be consistent. That's a really important discussion for the Forest Service that they're working on right now. And kind of from just an overall, are we doing additionality in terms of just doing work? Well, like, I think the hard thing about additionality is when there's a 0% deliverable, anything above that's additional. You know what I mean? I mean, I just think about the Mount Baker and some of the stuff we've done up there.
Great, thanks, Trevor. So our one last question here before we wrap up. GNA is new and we're still learning a lot, but has there been any consideration, or is there a possibility of using GNA revenue or income for collaborative capacity? Could you think about it that? Is there a chance? I know it's an interesting question, but collaboratives struggle with capacity funding all the time. So is there a creative way to use this to support that?
I'll try and take that one because it came up in our group and talking about the types of projects to fund. This first go around with a small tranche of funding, it wasn't really a concern. But looking at the authority, it's like, where in that authority could you find the space to do that? And the group seemed to think, and this hasn't been necessarily, vetted at the regional level, but in the efforts towards planning. So the collaborative can help with that planning and advancing things. So that's where it could be. But I would say there has to be, I think, the state and the Forest Service come to agreement on that, because at the district and forest level, I don't know if our people were quite comfortable with it, but it was something our collaborative members were asking for sure.
One last thing to add to that. The only way so GNA money is to conduct boots on the ground work. That's the primary focus of it, whether that's the planning component or whatever. Really the way that collaboratives can tap into it isn't really from like I got to fund the lights on sort of thing. It's, I'm going to fund work that we're going to do out on the ground. That to me is probably your best bet to figure out how you can tap into revenue, because there has to be an output, whether that's we're going to go do stand exams for the Forest Service as the collaborative, or we're going to go help lay out boundaries as the collaborative. It's got to be focused on an implementation component or components of planning that move something that is very defined. That's my recommendation for collaboratives. You've got to get crazy, like we're going to crank some acreages and volumes out kind of thing, And if you can do that, there's a place for it. That's my recommendation.
Thanks, Trevor. So we are at time today. Thank you everyone for joining us and for all our panelists. You guys are fantastic. I'm gonna switch to sharing my screen for a second as we wrap up. But thanks everyone for joining and participating in this workshop. This is the last of the series. I will follow up in an email afterwards with the PowerPoints from today, as well as the recording of this of the webinar. It will be posted to the event webpage. Thanks so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.